Welcome back as we continue our discussion on discussion on European worldview. Hey boos, wanted to continue talking about the European psyche and global white domination. In this mini lecture, we're going to review one of the most dynamic beast mode theorists on the European psyche, Dr. Marimba Ani. Dr. Marimba Ani ventured, she's the one here on the right. I don't know. Let's look at the laser pointer. Y'all know what I'm talking about. This one right here. That's Cresswell. So we'll talk about her next. This is Marimba Ani, the premier and researcher, theorist on European psyche, and her continued work on things such as the work of John Henrik Clarke and Abako Soon. So Marimba Ani wanted to look at a model of the European worldview. And in her analysis, she attempted to give an African language to European behavior. And a part of her emphasis is always studying African cosmology, African ways of knowing, so African epistemology, and using that to interpret and analyze not only European behavior, of course, the behavior of African people, to improve the African survival thrust. So one great work that she created was a work called Yurugu. The term Yurugu means the incomplete being. And the comprehensive statement is the incomplete being conceived in denial of a natural order. But Yurugu is a Dogon term, and it comes from Dogon mythology. And as the story goes, might get a little bit of details wrong, which I'll be all right. That all the groups or people were races, if you will, of people were attempting to be born, and all of the components, they waited patiently for this component, all the necessary components of creation. Based on Dogon mythology, the Yurugu, the incomplete being, conceived in denial of the natural order, refused to wait, and its urgency was wanted to be created hastily and left a significant component out of creation, just refused. And the earlier beings of existence, then characterized by this incompleteness, who are then ultimately in a perpetual search for wholeness. So the Yurugu, also symbolized by the pale fox, is the representation of the European as the incomplete being. And this helps to bring context to the European worldview once you study it well. Understand how European thoughts came into existence. And just like our previous unit where we talked about chaos, disorder, all those things that undergird the European psyche, European thought, even European axiology, you can see that this concept of Yurugu really gives us context. I forgot my thought, Charlie. All right. So the prototype for contextualizing the nature, dynamics, and function of European culture and its primary manifestations of white domination and control throughout the world is this concept of Yurugu. Yurugu emphasizes it articulates a clear understanding. This concept of Yurugu clearly articulates the aspects of the European psyche, European behaviors of domination throughout the world, so that we understand this prototypic European behavior. And again, we're using this to build context for our next work. So Marimba Ani is very important, very critical individual in terms of her research and work. She used, again, African terms to define or explain European concepts. So in her emphasis on the research of Yurugu, she revealed 3 key terms: the Asili, Utamawazo, and Utamaroho. The Asili is the germ or seed of culture, the cultural deep structure or the nucleus of culture. So we could say that the culture of the Asili of African culture is spirit. The seed of African culture is this very deep connection to spirit. And so from the African perspective, the thoughts and beliefs of the culture come from the Asili. So the thought about the importance and significance of spirit, the belief in spirit being, and all the things that connect to it. So then the actions or the manifestations of the culture would emerge for the African is a harmony with nature, because African people see spirit in all components of nature. The Utamaroho, again, the actions and manifestation, means that African people are loving, giving, open. That's all a part of that foundational component of spirit as a part of the Utamawazo and a part of the cultural seed, the Asili. So Marimba Ani, in her analysis, wanted to look at and understand the Yurugu, the incomplete being, who again denied as part of creation that we believe is spirit, or Ani emphasizes the spirit, and came into being in incompleteness. So then we want to take a look at the Yurugu Asili, the Yurugu Utamawazo, and the Yurugu Utamaroho, and how they have been manifested in the world, and you can use it for later analysis. So the European Utamawazo is, and I want to make sure that we highlight the thoughts and beliefs for Utamawazo and manifestations of culture for Utamaroho. The European Utamawazo is one of dichotomization, objectification, linearity. We talked about that in the previous unit if you watched it. So when we get to the European Utamaroho, if the thoughts and beliefs are around dichotomization, objectification, then the Utamaroho, the actions, can reflect that of conquering, enslaving, and even this rhetorical ethic, or this emphasis on the European supposedly being the savior of humanity. So remember, we're dealing with the concept of Yurugu, the incomplete being, and understanding that a part of the European cosmology is one that emphasizes objectification, dichotomization, that either or phenomenon. You're either black or white. You're either good or bad. And then if you are not that good, then you are the subject of the European art. So the Yurugu, then, we identify the seed of culture. And from the perspective of the European, the Yurugu Asili has a need for control and power. We'll find that many African black theorists, psychologists who are culturally oriented understand the Eurasian cultural seed, the cultural Asili, and its emphasis on control and power. Remember, the deficit that Yurugu did not allow to come into existence was spirit. So the idea then is that the need for control and power fills the void of the spiritual deficiency. And the Yurugu then expresses itself through Eurocentric cognitions. Again, the Utamawazo, being the thoughts and beliefs, is materialism. So the action, the Utamaroho, emphasizes enslavement. And when we get to the enslavement part, then there's no need to consider the human being or the human life, because everything is about the power of materialism. So, the Yurugu then embodies this concept throughout all of the institutions, and we see it throughout history and the conquering spirit of the Yurugu, the incomplete being. One example that we use in talking about the Utamawazo being materialism and the Utamaroho being enslavement is this institution of slavery. African people were not treated as human beings. The African body was not considered important. And in previous units, we talked about the rape of African women, the beating, the throwing overboard of African bodies, simply because the ship that they brought the Africans over against their will had too many, so they didn't want to get fined, so they would kill African people on the spot and throw them overboard. Also, the manifestation of the European Utamawazo, reflected in the Utamaroho, is global imperialism, colonization, war, conquest, consumption and expansion, and how they engage in religion. So, one theorist argues that European people are steeped in rhetoric. Their thought is steeped in rhetoric. Their behavior, I got it wrong. European people engage in rhetorical ethic that is steeped in rhetoric. So this refers to the European propensity for rhetoric, meaning hypocrisy, deception, camouflage, disguise, false-faced behavior in intercultural interactions. For example, European people express their emphasis on saving the Africans from themselves by going into the continent of Africa and pulling people, literally ripping them from families, homes, villages, government, nation state, all of the things in ways that human beings behave and engage. But the point from the European perspective was they felt that the African was so backwards and behind that they had to save the African from themselves. The European never gave credence to all the great things that African people created throughout history and all the very dynamic contributions African people have made to the world by way of science, technology, engineering, math, literacy, education across the board. So the rhetoric is that they had to save the African from themselves. That's the false face. Because really, they beat, raped, killed, violently aggressed upon the African in the enslavement process. Ramifications from slavery still exist to this day. Benefits for the European, ramifications for the African. They don't want you to talk about that. So, the rhetoric that continues to be expressed is a superficial verbal expression. The European wants us to believe false information, again, so we don't challenge. Yurugu, and another example of how this manifestation happened is, or continues to happen, still has the same ramifications as Christianity. Now, I know I'm hurting some of my Christians' feelings, especially the African Christians. Y'all will be all right. Because you should already know how Christianity eventually became deemed a universal religion. But it was also used as a justification for European imperialism, control, and domination throughout the world. In fact, they went so far as to tell stories about how African people were the children of Ham, and therefore African people should be enslaved because that is still being perpetuated to this day. So this notion of Yurugu then pushes their imperialistic political aggression around the world. And their effectiveness is so great that Africans to this day will argue the European religion, and some people argue that Christianity is not a European religion, it's an African religion, but with the painted white face, I'm talking about those who believe in the white man's God. They will choose the white person, Christian European person's God, over the gods of their ancestors, African gods. Right. So Marimba Ani was supported, and I'll just spend brief time on this, substantiated a little bit by a European American theorist, Michael Bradley. And he talked about and researched the psychobehavioral traits of racism. He argued that it's Eurocentric in its developmental foundation. And Cresswellsing argued that no other group of people emphasizes this idea or notion of race other than the European. So Michael Bradley actually supports that, because he argues, as a European American theorist, that the origins are deeply rooted in the evolutionary psychogenic history of the European. This also supports Job's two-cradle theory that we talked about in the previous unit, that the glacial environment led to pathological temporal aggression. So if we think about that, being and existing in harsh environments may impact your ability to feel okay with sharing in abundance. If you scrapping and trying to survive, remember Darwin's survival of the fittest, then it's less likely, based on the comparative analysis of the African worldview model and the European worldview model, you're less likely to share. If you have to hunt for food versus the African having abundance, you're less likely to share. Therefore, Bradley's work supports that of Chenkotchop's two-cradle theory and all the other subsequent worldview analysis. Bradley also argued that psychosexual frustrations have led to the inability of the white race to cope well with intellectual conflict. That is a very important note, because oftentimes if people present, other people of color, even other Europeans present, but primarily people of color, a counter theory to European thought that they are attempting to make universal, Europeans will become aggressive and want to, or struggle with, having coping nonviolently with the paradox. So Europeans will struggle with that intellectual debate, and will have trouble accepting other theoretical perspectives. So I offer this as our discussion on Marimba Ani, with a little piece of Bradley's model in there. In our next unit, we'll discuss her friend, Frances Cress-Welsing. I am your professor, if I didn't say it before, Dr. Slater Sarah. And we doing this black thing. We trying to understand what's going to help black people. Till next time, peace.